Yeah, so this is a project, George, Kim, Armin, and other Shabbat have been working on for a little bit of time. It's super preliminary. It's kind of related to some other work that we've been doing on China. This is kind of a, I guess in some sense a much broader project. Not about a specific case study, but about trade dynamics in general and how they relate to policy dynamics. So I'd say if there is any unifying question in the trade literature, it is this, which is simply how much does trade change when in a given, bilateral trade relationship or a multilateral trade relationship, depending on the context, when trade policy changes in some way. And there's a lot of different answers, and I'll get to that in a minute. I'd say the thing that people in this room, the five of us, specifically, but I think a number of others have focused on is that the answer to this question is pretty dynamic. It takes, quite a bit of time for the transition to a change in policy to come about, and you get a much larger response in the long run than in the short run. And a lot of people have worked on this in a variety of ways. Certainly the five of us have done quite a bit of work on it. One of the thing that we want to focus on in this paper is that, kind of the right-hand side, if you will, of this question is also really dynamic. There's lots of examples of this. Free trade areas, NAFTA, things like that, are pretty much always phased in over, 5, 15 years, et cetera, which means that there's a great deal of anticipation going on, right? Firms start reacting right away when they learn about these policy announcements before the subsequent tariff changes that materialize over those 5 to 15 years actually come into play. Anti-dumping, that's something that is pretty transitory and generally known to sunset after 5 years or so. And again, there's kind of an anticipation element there. There's also a great deal of uncertainty surrounding anti-dumping. Anti-dumping investigations start. We're not sure whether tariffs are eventually going to go up at the end of that investigation. So uncertainty seems to be pretty important as well in terms of the way that policy dynamics work. Uncertainty has been kind of the centerpiece of the literature on the U.S.-China trade relationship. The U.S. conferred, normal trade relation status on China unilaterally, but in a conditional manner, which meant it could potentially be revoked back in 1980. And until China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, it's generally agreed that there was a great deal of uncertainty about, whether China's access to MFN tariffs under NDR status would continue. And lots of people have worked on that. We're working on that in another project currently. Similarly, this current stuff that's going on in the US-China is also pretty uncertain when the Trump tariffs are eventually going to end. We don't really know, but I think, do we really think they're going to last forever? I don't know. Brexit, I've worked on that as well. That's kind of involves a lot of these different elements. There's an anticipation element in that we learned that Brexit was going to happen several years in advance. There was uncertainty about ultimately how much trade policy would change when Brexit eventually occurred. There's still probably a good deal of uncertainty going on there. Anyway, lots of examples of policy dynamics. So what we're going to do in this paper is ask how these policy dynamics shape the dynamics of trade. And one of the questions that's really crucial to try to sort out, and we're not going to get all the way there today, as this is pretty preliminary work, is how can we distinguish responses to current policy, namely changes in tariffs that we observe today, from responses to new information about future policy. Okay, and as I've kind of already emphasized, the key themes in this project are anticipation and uncertainty. So those are the things that we're going to kind of focus on in terms of the way that policy is dynamic. Now, to put a little bit more structure on what we're doing, when you go out into the data and try to measure how trade responds to some policy change over time, the object that we're particularly, usually interested in is what we're going to call the cumulative trade elasticity. Simply how much trade grows between some periods T-1, if period T is when policy changes, and period T plus H relative to the amount that tariffs change over the same period. And this object, I think, is pretty important. Throughout the trade literature, we use it to measure, the macroeconomic and welfare impact of past policy changes. We use this information to inform our quantitative models, and we conduct counterfactual experiments. And I think, most people in the room would probably agree that there's a wide range of estimates of what the numbers, what the left-hand side of this equation is in different contexts, lots of different estimation methods used. A lot of the conversation about the variation in these estimates comes down to things like what level of aggregation should you use, and what kind of fixed effect structure should you use and stuff like that. We're going to take a different perspective, which is that a lot of this variation is probably actually driven by variation in policy dynamics. And so I guess the last little bit of context before I get into the details of what we do is, for those of us that mostly do quantitative work, I'd say that the canonical, the quantitative exercise that you see most often is simply an unanticipated, immediate, and permanent change in tariffs, an MIT shock that causes tariffs to change now, immediately, once and for all. That's 99% of the exercises in the literature work that way. And there's two inputs that we need to conduct this kind of experiment in a quantitative sense. So the first one is typically the short-run trade elasticity, which is typically defined as the immediate response of trade to a change in policy that occurs today, holding fixed things like the capital stock and other accumulatable factors. And the one that we're going to focus on today is the number of exporting firms. And this parameter in lots of models maps to, directly to welfare gains, macro impact. So it's super important in quantifying the impact of trade. The assumption here, though, of course, is that this change in tariffs is unanticipated, right? If we knew that this change in tariffs was going to happen in, say, period T minus 10, again, if, policy's changing in T, then of course the number of firms can already start to react way ahead of the period in which trade starts to change, right? The second input is, how much trade ultimately ends up adjusting in the very long run. The overall response once investment, export participation, et cetera, have fully adjusted to the change in trade. And I guess this is kind of the practitioner's answer, the simple answer to the question, how much is trade going to change when policy changes? If there's a single answer, single way to answer that question, it's this. And there's also an assumption embedded here, which is that there's no uncertainty about the permanence of this change in tariffs. Another way to say that is that in the long run, the current tariff that we observe, that we're trying to measure the impact to, is also equal to the present value of the expected present value of future tariffs, right? And generally, that's often not going to be the case in the data. And so one of the questions that we're going to try to answer today, and this is part of this project that's very much still in progress, is how can we identify these, what I'm going to call, and I think this is probably bad language, but I don't really know, this is what I'm going to call it today. How can we identify these true elasticities in the short run and the long run from data that include reforms that feature anticipation and uncertainty? So that's the context. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to first use a model to illustrate how trade responds to anticipated and or uncertain reforms. In particular, we're going to use a model in which firms make forward-looking export participation decisions. And I'm going to spend a bit of time going through some numerical exercises that kind of illustrate this in several ways. And then we're going to go to the data, and we are going to try to come up with a couple of ways to classify U.S. trade reforms in the past by the degree of anticipation and uncertainty that kind of was embedded in them. And we're going to look at how what the distribution of reforms looks like across these different dimensions. And we're going to see to what extent do we observe variation in trade elasticity dynamics across these different kinds of reforms. It's we're going to show it's pretty consistent with the theory. And kind of the part of this project that's so very much ongoing is to develop some methods to, again, identify these, what I've called true short and long run responses from this messy data, which does, as I'm going to show you, feature quite a bit of uncertainty and anticipation. So here's a preview of what we find. And the first two bullet points here are true both in the model and in the data. Anticipation increases short-run trade elasticities and reduces long-run trade elasticities. And this is primarily because exporters are reacting before policy actually changes. Uncertainty, further lowers long-run trade elasticities because exporters, as we're going to see in the model, care primarily about future policy when they're making the decisions whether to enter or exit the export market rather than current policy.
Can I just ask Joe on the first one? I don't really understand why it would reduce the long run.
Yeah, so
some of it's kind of been.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, and to some degree, that's going to depend, as I'll show you, on the way in which you measure the trade elasticity dynamics, specifically the period from
Okay,
which you
so I'm
start your
saying, does it
measurement.
reduce the true one, I would think it does.
Yeah, okay, fine. So that's absolutely right. It doesn't reduce, and what I've defined as the true elasticities are not affected by either of these things. And again, you can kind of think about these true elasticities as the ones that you would observe in this kind of, platonic trade reform
Where
exercise.
everything's permanent and expected to be there forever.
Yeah, and it's an MIT shock, when it first comes into play. Yeah, I'll get to this in a minute, but as a very, very brief preview, the basic idea is that if you start measuring trade elasticities from the period, right before policy changes,
then you'll miss some.
then trade is already elevated, because if we've kind of already anticipated that this is going to happen for a couple of periods, we've already started to react. Yeah, that's the basic idea.
So you need another length, you need the opposite of true to put in there. Like,
Sure, no, that's right. I guess
something.
observe,
Yeah.
or,
Naive.
Yeah, we need the language is, any suggestions that are going to help us with clarifying the language here would be very welcome. We're not at all settled on any of these terms. And when we go to the data, what we're going to see is that most reforms are, in fact, gradual, they're transitory, they do seem to feature a great deal of uncertainty and also anticipation, which means that conventional estimates of trade dynamics are, really, I don't know whether the language should be distorted or biased or whatever, but they're, materially affected by these issues.
But on that one, the transitory, isn't it true though that typically, until Trump, things just tended to go down and not go back up again so much?
Sorry, I'm hard of hearing with the mass.
Oh, sorry,
what should go down and then go back up?
I'm just saying, I thought things were pretty we have NAFTA, and then it's not like we have un-NAFTA until Trump came along.
Yeah, so that's right. And so, in fact,
Basically,
one of the things that we're going to do in a moment when we go to the data is take some reforms that we know are kind of close to this platonic, unanticipated, permanent, immediate exercise, and see that we observe pretty different trade elasticity dynamics in those reforms as compared to, what we observe in kind of the most common policy change, which is in fact, pretty gradual, transitory, et cetera.
What would be an example of a transitory one that we're all familiar with?
Something like anti-dumping tariffs, or something that is
more micro things that are.
Yeah, there's rules of
I guess this
rules of origin,
right.
things that bite a larger fraction of goods in a particular industry than others, than in one period than in others, stuff like that. And then, so the way that, the perspective that we're taking to try to figure out how to identify what I've called, but, probably not, again, good language, the true short and long run trade elasticities is that, in the model, if you control for the extensive margin of trade, which, in a model, you can directly observe how many firms are currently exporting. And in some context in the data, you can do that. We're going to look at some proxies later on. That helps us identify the true short run response to a trade reform, even when that reform is anticipated. Another thing that we can do to help identify the long run elasticity, and the true long run elasticity to a permanent certain policy change, is to take into account some information about the present value of future tariffs. Now, that's obviously an object that's pretty difficult to measure in the data. When we do this in a model, it does kind of work, and we can also do a pretty good job of estimating actually firms' beliefs about the likelihood of future policy changes. But how we put this into practice in the data, not exactly sure yet. Okay. So let's go to the model very quickly, and then I will just show you what happens in the model when we conduct these different kinds of experiments, anticipated and uncertain trade reform. So the model, I'm going to talk about it pretty briefly, because it's a model that I think a number of people in this room have already seen in some way or another. It's just going to be a partial equilibrium version of the model that George Kim and Horeg Choi developed and published this year in the JIE. It's a model that features pretty slow adjustment between the short run and the long run, and a very large gap between the short run and the long run in terms of trade elasticity. So it's a good model to use to try to see how this gap and the speed of adjustment depend on the dynamic nature of policy. And in particular, as in any kind of model where exporters make forward-looking decisions about export participation, what matters for these decisions is expectations about future policy, not current policy. So very brief preview of the way the model works. Firms are going to be heterogeneous in productivity and a variable trade cost, which is going to kind of govern what I call the export capacity of the firm. We're not going to look at endogenous entry and exit today because it's a partial equilibrium model. So firms are just going to die with some constant probability and then get replaced by newborn firms. If you want to be an exporter, you're going to pay a sunk cost. And then once you're already an exporter, you pay a smaller fixed cost to continue doing that if you'd like. And the longer you've been an exporter, the greater chance you have of attaining a low variable trade cost, of becoming a high capacity, really good exporter. Trade policy, I'm not going to say anything about it yet. We're going to allow for really any kind of trade policy that you can envision, but the basic idea is we're going to allow for innovations, both the current tariffs as well as expectations about future tariffs. Here's how the kind of static portion of the model works. Firms are going to produce some output using labor. Again, they're heterogeneous in productivity. They're going to face the usual CES demand curve that's going to depend on the price the firm charges and the current tariff tau t. That's the current tariff tau t is going to govern how much firms sell to do. Firms face a resource constraint in terms of they've got to produce a little bit more stuff than they ultimately want to get to the foreign destination. So this guy here, Xi, is going to be our variable trade cost. It's going to govern a firm's export capacity. So the static portion of the firm's problem, totally standard. Just choose your price to maximize your float profits given your current state variables. The dynamic portion of the model, firms, as I said, this variable trade cost captures a firm's kind of export status and capacity as an exporter, if you will. So it can take three values: infinity, which means you're not an exporter at all; Xi H, which means you're a low capacity exporter, your variable trade cost is high; or Xi L, which means you're a high capacity exporter, right? Your variable trade cost is low. All firms, when they are born, start as non-exporters. And depending on what they do, the costs, both fixed and variable, of exporting in the following period depend on their current export status today. So new exporters, if I am currently a non-exporter, I decide to become an exporter today, I pay a fixed cost of 0. And I start in the next period with a low export capacity. Continuing exporters, if I'm already an exporter, I pay a lower continuation cost at 1. And next period, with some probability, I switch variable trade costs. So if I'm currently a low capacity exporter with Xi H, with some probability 1 minus rho Xi, I switch to becoming a high capacity exporter. If I'm already a high capacity exporter, again, there's a symmetric probability that I might lose that status and switch back to becoming a bad exporter. Given these state variables, the dynamic problem of a firm is simply to choose whether or not to export in the following period. And you can write that dynamic program like that. Yeah.
So I guess, should I interpret it as the kind of key assumption you need is that new exporters, they pay a higher fixed cost, but they also have a higher probability of being a low export capacity firm. That would be the key.
Yeah, so if I'm...
I mean, the probability 1, but if I were to think of it that,
Yeah, so there's two elements to this. If I won't decide to continue being an exporter, yeah, both I get a lower fixed, a continuation cost or fixed cost of being an exporter in the future. But also, yeah, the longer I've been an exporter, the longer I continue to, decide to stay an exporter, the higher probability I'm going to have of being a high capacity exporter. Yeah, so the evolution of my export capacity is exogenous, conditional on my decision to, continue being an exporter for several periods in a row. But it's, it certainly governs firms' incentives to enter and exit the export market. Yeah. Anyway. The firm's problem looks like that. You get your flow profits from exporting today, depending on whether your current export status. And then tomorrow, if you decide to pay your fixed cost, which you can write as a, concisely as a function of your export capacity, you then remain an exporter or start as an exporter next period, or you can be a non-exporter, which means that your variable trade cost goes back to infinity. right? And then you kind of start the whole process over in the following period. So that's pretty much the model. It's pretty simple. It's not too much to it. We compute aggregate trade in the model simply by aggregating over the distribution of firms, the joint distribution of productivity and export status. The only thing that's really worth saying about this equation is that sales per firm, the intensive margin of trade, depends only on current tariffs, right? The price that I'm going to charge and the demand for my product depends on my current tariff.
I see the extensive margin can be anticipatory.
The extensive margin, the distribution of productivity and export status, which governs the extensive margin of trade, depends both on past tariffs, because it depends on, the decisions that firms made in the past to enter the export market. And of course, it also depends on future tariffs, because firms' decisions, to enter this market or to exit the market today depend on what they think about the future.
Sorry, I'm still a little bit confused. How should I think about the high versus low capacity exporters? Say that I want to think about them in the data. How would I disentangle them in the data?
Well, you can talk to, we can talk to these guys who measured this stuff a lot more carefully than I did. But the basic idea is that these parameters, the difference between a low and a high capacity exporter and the probability of becoming a high capacity exporter, map to the moments of exporter life cycle dynamics, right? So the difference between these guys maps to, on average, how much exporters' sales grow with their tenure, as an exporter.
And that should be conditional on volatility, right?
You can recover that.
You can do it, yeah, you can kind of think about it on average, but
in the CES, it's going to exactly pull out.
yeah. Yeah, but then that's the way, the way that these parameters are calibrated is by looking at those kinds of moments. I'll talk about the calibration in just a
Again,
second.
I'll go back because I don't know the model at all, but for new exporters, right? With probability 1, they become a low export capacity.
Yeah, so
Right.
the first time you're an exporter, you start as a low capacity exporter.
Right, so do you
That's right.
need that? I mean, it could be that you had some probability, just like the continuing exporters, right? And that's what I was kind of thinking about, that do you need to have that the probability that a new exporter becomes a low export capacity firm? You need that probability to be higher than the probability that a continuing exporter
Yeah.
continues to be a high capacity.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could do it that way too.
No, but do you need that kind of direction? Could it
George
go-
already talks, now I feel like I get to talk now.
Oh.
I'm gonna try not to talk at all. But the idea is that there's this moment in the data that says new exporters start off small, and then on
Yes.
average conditional on staying in the market, you get bigger. And so by having everybody start small, then you get this upward trajectory. If it was just like a stationary thing, like some people come in big, some people come in small, then on average, everybody would stay kind of the same size. So the idea of coming in small is so that we can match this pattern in the data. And the second pattern in the data is that a lot of exporters exit. Right. And so you don't either get a good C, because C become a CL. We should write a letter that I can pronounce better. but
Yeah, I know.
CL,
Well, you guys use it in your paper, so.
then if you don't like get a good shot exit, so you get this kind of, there's a lot of exit on average, small guys grow.
I see.
And this is one way to do it, but there's other ways to do it. Dury and Fitzgerald has paper where you kind of pick up an exporter base, right? You accumulate customers, kind of those types of model. This is just a different way to kind of.
Yeah, this is a parsimonious, easy to calibrate way to do that.
Talking about alternative ways, what about your own paper with?
Yeah, no, I have some work on that as well.
yeah.
Okay, so you're gonna put up a competitor to this.
Yeah.
This is the generalization
This is-
of the Baldwin-Dixon Krugman Gauss-Roberts timeout technology.
Yeah, so this is a nice base.
Yeah, it's just a
for-
relaxing.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
relaxation of their
Yeah,
assumption.
so if I
Yeah,
go back
rather
to
than
the
doing-
intro,
Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought the point we shouldn't focus on this particular model. Mark. You're gonna, so
Yeah, look,
I have a model where these elasticities have been.
Yeah, look,
tested.
the
I'm
only
gonna
thing
show
that-
you a
yeah,
method,
no, that's
apply it to a particular model. You guys will have your own model and you
Yeah,
use it for those.
everything that I'm going to show you is going to be true about any model in which, these exporter life cycle dynamics are present, and any model in which these guys are looking to the future to make their export participation decisions.
Yeah.
Everything I'm going to show you is about that. This model is a good one because it has the way that it's set up delivers a pretty large difference between the short run and the long run quantitatively. So it's very easy to see how these elements that I'm going to show you affect that gap and the transition to the long run. Okay, so anyway, we measure aggregate exports this way. The true quote unquote short run elasticity is simply the CES demand elasticity, as in any Melitz-based model. The long run response, certainly is going to be bigger than that, and it's kind of increasing in the difference between a good and a bad exporter, and the probability of switching, which governs how many good exporters there are going to ultimately be in the long run. So it's pretty easy to calibrate this model to match whatever you think are the true short run and the long run. But of course, the question in the data is, what are those things? So today we're just going to do some numerical exercises. We're just going to take the parameters of this model directly from the other paper, so I'm not going to talk too much about them. The moments that we use to calibrate these things are things like the export participation rate, the exit rate, and the average sales of a new exporter relative to an incoming. So here's the first experiment we're going to do in the model. We're just going to do a couple of different flavors of the Platonic permanent trade reform. We're going to start in a steady state with high tariffs, go to free trade, beginning in period T sub R, which is the period in which policy changes. We'll have a couple of flavors. The first one is simply, unanticipated and immediate, which is, the one that everybody's familiar with. We'll think about an anticipated version of this where firms learn in period TA for announcement that this policy change is going to happen 10 periods ahead of time. And we'll also consider a different flavor of anticipation in which this reform is phased in, occurs gradually over 10 periods, so that even when you learn about it in TR, there's still some anticipation in that you are anticipating these subsequent tariff changes that are going to materialize over the next 10 years. So we can combine these different flavors, in various ways. I'll show you all 4 combinations. So here's the canonical one. Unanticipated immediate, standard trade dynamics. Trade doesn't start to change until period, and this is, I guess, period TR. That trade response maps over here to 4, our elasticity, our calibrated short run elasticity. The long run elasticity is a bit over 15. Takes quite a few years to get there. Now, what about when this reform is anticipated? Ignoring phase-in effects. Here's what happens. Trade starts to react 10 periods in advance of policy actually changing. And so by the time the reform actually occurs, trade is way up here. We're almost already all the way at the long run in terms of trade, right? And if we're measuring the cumulative trade elasticity relative to, starting in, period TR, so we're just measuring how much trade has changed relative to the period right before the reform actually occurred. This comes back to your question before. What we're going to see then is that the trade elasticity barely changes in the long run, right? We're going to start here, and not much is going to happen because we're already almost at the long run. And I'll show you in a minute what happens if we start measuring this relative to the period in which the information was released.
That's the long run, and the short one is going to look like nothing. Right?
Yeah, and as you probably expect, what is instead going to happen is the short run elasticity is going to be massive. I'll show you that picture.
Oh, I thought it would be almost zero because you look when it happened, nothing really happened.
Well, yeah, I'll show you in just a minute. But I guess the key thing to see about why this is happening is that the present value of tariffs, the path of the present value of tariffs looks quite different than the path, the realized trajectory of tariffs shown here. Right? The present value of tariffs has already fallen a ton 10 periods before the reform even occurs. Here's what happens if this reform is phased in. If firms, even if it's the initial change is unanticipated, trade doesn't start to change until period 0, and it, changes a lot more gradually. But the path of, the present value of tariffs looks a little bit different. And what we end up with is this kind of weird, non-monotonic trade dynamics when we measure the response of trade relative to how much trade policy has changed. trade starts to react a lot in the beginning to these really small policy changes because firms know that they're going to get some more policy changes that are going to continue to occur on top of, the really small initial one that's occurred. Finally, you want to combine this with, the whole thing is anticipated 10 periods ahead of time and then phased in over 10 years. You get the purple line. And again, you see some kind of wacky trade elasticity dynamics. In fact, when we measure trade relative to the period in which policy changed, the short run trade elasticity appears to be higher than the long run trade elasticity, and the short run elasticity is huge.
I see, I screwed up because the short one's always gonna have the intensive margin.
The short run's always going to have the
Can't get
intensive
less
margin.
than the intensive margin.
Yeah, that's right. Now, here's what happens if you instead do, kind of what you suggested earlier, which is to measure this stuff starting from, 10 periods earlier. So 10 periods, in the period before anybody learns about this reform, in all cases, trade is always kind of at its initial steady state with 30% tariff. So we're kind of measuring relative to that starting point. There, the long run elasticity is always going to be the same because trade is ultimately converging to the same level in the long run. And we're just measuring that level relative to the initial steady state with 30% tariffs. But then you get this, you can get some kind of crazy short run stuff, right? The short run response to these anticipated reforms becomes even larger, right? So regardless of which way you want to measure this stuff, anticipation affects both the short run, it always affects the short run, and can also affect the long run depending on how you are measuring this stuff. So you see a big variation in what, the response of trade over time, depending on the kind of anticipatory properties of the reform that you're looking at.
Somehow, stop me if I'm kind of messing up your flow, but somehow it feels like the intensive margin effect is really simple because it just depends on what happened now.
No, that's right.
I feel like you could take your day to clean out all the intensive margin effect, just get rid of that, and then really focus on the extensive margin, which is kind of.
Well, part of what you want to be able to do is to try to figure out how you can do that in the data. And as I'll,
okay.
is I guess, how can I do that?
Okay. So suppose you just have an elasticity for that. I mean,
well,
just starting.
Yeah.
I know.
Sure.
Assuming too much, but if you had an elasticity, any elasticity for that, almost instantaneously with the data, you could just.
If I want to assume a short run,
remove that part.
Yeah, if I'm comfortable making an assumption or taking a stand on what that short run elasticity is, sure.
Yeah, but then that suggests some sort of routine where you
make
a guess at that, clean it out, do your fancy thing. It doesn't work very well, so then try a different one for the short run.
But the question is what should be this intensive margin elasticity? Ultimately, we've got to measure that in the data in some way.
Yeah, but I'm just saying it's not very exotic. It's just some number.
It's some number.
And that maps your tariff changes to some value of trade change. So it's sort of not very sophisticated, which means you can kind of get rid of it quickly and then.
Yeah, if you knew what it was, you could. I think you could do that. That's true.
Somewhere buried in there.
But ultimately the question is, there's already, there's a lot of disagreement in the literature about what that elasticity should be. There's a lot of different numbers that you see.
Maybe what I'm saying is that another idea would be, couldn't you use sort of more purely econometric techniques, that very reduced form thing to get that, because you see it right away, so it would have to be the thing that explains.
That's partly what we're emphasizing. What do you mean when you see it right away?
I'm saying that because it's the intensive margin, it just happens as soon as the tariff changes. Well, then.
But that depends on that. What I'm showing you here is that that depends on what, where we're starting from and what firms knew, the period before policy change.
On any expectations, because it's just the tariff change. So those firms.
But what if I knew that tariff
change?
But what if I knew that tariff change was going to happen?
That would only affect the extensive margin, not the intensive margin.
It would, right. So you have to have a way of measuring the extensive margin in the data. Absolutely.
I was thinking you could just.
I was gonna maybe I would turn this question two ways. So one is like, suppose you had firm level data then you kind of knew exactly
Yeah,
who the guys
exactly.
incumbents
Who
already
should
were.
Respond.
Yeah, who are already sort of, if you already knew exactly who was already the incumbents are, then you could just read the short run elasticity right off.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like
But
saying
you
you
have-
have data on Caterpillar or something, and they have the China tariffs, and you just say,
Sure.
oh, they sold less Caterpillars because China just put a tariff out, but that effect nails the.
Yeah, you'd have to have
the
some information
intensive
on.
margin one, I guess.
So
I know
then-
you said short run, but
Then we're gonna try to do it backwards, which is we're gonna try
Yeah.
to take data on the extensive margin and use that to clean out the, I shouldn't take
Okay,
away
yeah,
Joe's,
okay.
Let's-
but
yeah.
we're gonna try to do something.
I'll show
similar in a
you,
different
we're gonna
format.
do something we're gonna try to do something kind of like what you have in mind. Let me show you the other set of experiments quickly before we get there, and then we'll look at the data. Okay, so, yeah,
Sorry, maybe I missed it some point, but conditional on being an exporter and a productivity and a tariff. A change in the expected value is not going to change your path, right? That's all governed by the probability of switching to the.
conditional on being an exporter, a change in the probability of, well, for
Yeah,
what?
changing the future policy.
Well, it's gonna change, but it's gonna change my decision about whether to continue to be an exporter in the future.
But
Yeah.
the dynamic is to grow is governed all by the probability of switching to.
Conditional on continuing to make a decision to remain as an exporter, yes, that's true. But policy dynamics are going to change that decision. Okay, so this is what we learned from just looking at some different flavors of permanent trade reforms. Anticipation in various ways can increase the short, is always going to increase the short run trade elasticity and can also decrease the measured long run elasticity, depending on the way in which you measure it. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to look at some uncertain exercises. The first set is going to look kind of like what the US-China, kind of a very stylized version of the US-China thing. Namely, there's a trade reform that looks exactly like the one I just showed you. Here we go from 30% to free trade, but there's a 50% chance per period that this reform may be reversed, that the US is going to take away this NTO status. And we'll look at a version of this in which this uncertainty lasts forever, and a version in which it's resolved after 20 periods, kind of like China joining the WTO and this uncertainty either disappearing or falling along. And then the second thing we'll look at is something that's a little bit different, which is just simply a Markov process for tariffs. Right? Firms have rational expectations about this Markov process, and we can just observe what happens, in the model when we switch from, say, high tariffs to low tariffs. Okay, and how that transition depends on, the properties of that process, whether these changes are very persistent or very transitory. Okay, so here's the first set, the kind of China exercises. The realized path of trade looks the same in all the cases that we're going to look at. We're just going to go from 30% tariffs to free trade forever, and we're going to stay there. But what happens with trade volumes depends obviously very much on whether this uncertainty gets resolved or not. If it doesn't, if this uncertainty lasts forever, then trade converges to a relatively low level. And correspondingly, the long run trade elasticity is quite a bit lower than what we think is kind of the true elasticity I just showed you with the previous set of exercises. Conversely, if this uncertainty is eventually resolved, trade will start to grow again and eventually converge to the true long run trade elasticity that we saw before, right? And basically what's going on here is a couple of periods ahead of this resolution, the present value of tariffs really starts to fall as firms are, recognize that there's only a couple of periods left. If they can just make it to WTO accession, they're going to be home free and, trade starts moving again. So uncertainty, depending on, whether it's, there forever or whether it disappears, can also really affect the long run. And even if it does ultimately get resolved, you can see that it really draws out the transition, right? So if you're measuring, if you think the long run is after 20 periods or 25 periods, you're definitely not measuring the true long run elasticity. If you're just going to say, look at this period.
I kind of think of that could be called the Pierce-Shot or Henley.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's
And then
exactly
you
right.
could kind of make
This
sure
is-
your model. kind of
This is the
generates-
effect that they,
And you can
that
kind of
they're
cross-check your
looking at.
model about whether it generates what they're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, you can, yeah, that's exactly right. Finally, the Markov exercises. This one's kind of interesting, something that we didn't, we didn't really think about until we looked at this, is that when you're looking at a very transitory trade reform, and again, the blue one here is just kind of the same permanent, immediate, canonical exercise just for reference, which another way to say that is that the transition probability is 0. You never switch between tariff states. If we compare to that and we go to say something that is, less persistent, more transitory, what you see is that even in the initial, if we were already with 30% tariffs for many periods, the present value of tariffs would be quite different because firms believe that there's, they already know that their tariff process is more transitory. So they're not really you're not already in a kind of a steady state, if you will. You're already in a world in which firms are kind of reacting ahead of time simply to the possibility that tariffs could change in the future because they know that that possibility becomes more and more likely the more transitory this process becomes. And so the present value of tariffs changes a lot less in reaction to a transitory reform. And so, not surprisingly, trade reacts a lot less. But trade is already elevated quite a bit in, say, a reform that is super transitory, an IIB reform. And in that kind of extreme case, what you get is, in fact, the trade elasticity is just constant over time. In response to an IIB reform, there's no extensive margin reaction whatsoever because firms always know tomorrow, regardless of where I am today, tomorrow it's just as likely that I'm going to have high or low tariffs. I don't even care about the current state for making my export. The current state has no bearing on what I should do, whether I should enter or stop exporting. And so there's no extensive margin reaction whatsoever. That really pushes down the difference between the short run and the long run. So regardless of what kind of uncertainty you're looking at, it's going to really depress the long run trade elasticity, the difference between the short run and the long run. And if uncertainty does ultimately get resolved, it does all, you get kind of the correct long run trade elasticity, but the transition takes a lot longer to come about. Okay, so those are the various exercises that I wanted to show you. And the purpose of this is simply just to say that policy dynamics, uncertainty, and anticipation really affect the path of trade. And the question then becomes, what kind of reforms do we actually see in the data? When we go out and measure trade elasticities and trade dynamics in the data, what kind of reforms are we actually looking at? So the way that we're going to do that is just look at the US data. We're going to look at 5-digit SITC data going all the way back to 1974. The same data that we've been looking at in our paper on China. And kind of the advantage of this is that it has a lot of these really big reforms like China, but also features a lot of other, as we'll see, a lot of very small transitory and gradual reforms. We're going to focus today on relative tariffs, what we're going to define as the tariff applied by the US on good G from country J relative to the MFN tariff or the NTR tariff that the US applies to all goods G. And that thing can change over time for a variety of reasons. Free trade agreements, the US is going to give lower tariffs to, say, Canada and Mexico, being granted NTR status, to begin with, or having it be revoked. Also, even things, MFN countries get hit with things like safeguards, anti-dumping, etc. So we're going to do a couple of things to look at kind of different kinds of reforms. One, for each country good pair, we're going to calculate the concentration index of relative tariff changes. So we're going to say, are the tariff changes that we observe and kind of the whole history of US trade with a particular country, say China, in a particular good G, are the tariff changes that we observe, are they kind of one-off, or are they happening, all the time, right? Is there one big one, this in the case of China, or are there a bunch of really small ones that are happening, all the time? And that's going to help us think about, to some degree, whether it's going to kind of capture, both uncertainty and anticipation to some degree. Phase-in stuff is going to show up here as less concentration, but also, simply impermanence and transitoriness is also going to show up And then we'll also do something different, which is for each individual policy change that we observe at the country good time level, we can calculate the half-life of that policy change. How many years does it take for that policy change to wash out? In particular, how many periods does it take for at most 50% of that policy change to remain in the data? And again, we can classify reforms that way and bucket them in the data. And then the last thing, as I mentioned before, we're going to kind of take a different tack, which is to look at reforms that we know happen to have been really big, at least ex post, permanent, and also immediate, not phased in. Reforms that we know that we can do kind of the best job possible of eliminating anticipation effects, and especially in the case of Vietnam, eliminating, as we'll see, uncertainty effects. And we can kind of compare what we get in those cases to what we see kind of in the rest of the data. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I didn't understand. So you have a JGT?
Yeah, this is source country J, good G, time T.
All right. So can you just explain again what they meant by for each relative?
What I mean is for each, if I observe a policy change in 1992, the US changes, its applied tariff on imports of processed chicken products from Sri Lanka in 1992. I can ask how many periods does it take before that policy change kind of starts to disappear in the data, right? If tariffs go up by 10%, how many periods does it take before that policy change goes back down to 5% or less? Yeah, it could, potentially, it could be that's right. Or it could be truncated by the end of the sample.
Joe, I feel like this is kind of like a quasi indirect inference. I don't know, I really thought this was a perfect case to do. Like you go to Tony Smith's first indirect inference, you specify this auxiliary model, he specified a VAR, it's very natural. It seems like, that's where I thought you'd go, you just like specify a nice, simple VAR that was flexible enough so you could enter variables, with the expectations and not, and then you just say, I just want to write something that can kind of span the model. And then that gives people a toolkit where they can just do this.
Well, so
you're doing being more clever, and I wonder.
Our goal here is I
want everybody else to be just as clever as you.
Our goal at this stage is, I think we're being less clever, if anything, than I think you think. Then perhaps you're attributing to us. So our goal at this stage is, I think, a little bit more modest. Our goal is simply to say we know from a model that trade dynamics look quite different depending on what type of reform you're looking at.
I think you should say.
Is that what we also see in the data?
And we're going to give you this procedure, and for a lot of reasonable models, this is what we see. You write down some other model, you could foresee this, and we bet you would find the same thing. That's how I pictured the introduction. So.
Yeah, so our goal is, I guess, at this stage anyway, not to tell you what kind of the true tariff, to tell you what the one true tariff process is, okay, but rather to say that in the data, to recognize that we do observe a lot of heterogeneous policy dynamics in the data, and to take that heterogeneity as given.
Well, that was trying to do, but in a standard way.
Okay, well, I mean, maybe we can talk about it a little bit more. Again, I think what we're doing is something pretty simple. All I'm going to do is look at, kind of bucket policy reforms by these different dimensions and look and estimate trade dynamics on different buckets separately, more or less. That's all we're doing. We will measure these things in a couple of different ways. The most obvious way is just to look at, kind of directly measure trade elasticities dynamics using, just the differences and differences, or, H period ahead trade on the left-hand side and H period ahead tariffs on the right-hand side. The simplest way to do it, it does kind of potentially get messed up by the lagged effect, the fact that trade might respond differently depending on, when during this H period window policy change. We'll look at kind of a different flavor of this, a local projections version, which is kind of the same, but we're going to instrument the H period ahead tariff change on the 0 period, the 1 period tariff change. It's something that's been done in another paper, another working paper basically the idea is you're kind of taking the average, properties of the tariff process, not for a specific tariff change, but for kind of the average policy change, to try to isolate the effect of what's starting to happen in period T on trade in subsequent periods. And the last one we're going to do, which this is the one that we like the best, seems to work the best in the model, unrestricted error correction mechanism, which is going to identify both the short run and the long run trade elasticity, as well as the speed of adjustment. And one thing that's kind of nice about this is that it nests a simple, cross-sectional specification in a steady state, in which the change in trade and the change in tariffs are both zero, which is we think is kind of nice. Anyway, first things first, what kind of reforms do we see in the data? Yeah.
So is there any sense in this where like product characteristics are gonna matter for your, for the way you're doing it, right? So like, when I think about Pearson Pratt, right, a lot of the identification was like cross product, right? Like these products have big change, in certain key, these have very small, right? But you're not really thinking about it in that way, right? Or like, some products might be easier to cut tariffs on.
Yeah, that's right. So we're not, what we are looking at here, I guess I can just show you. When we go into the data and just look at the distribution of either, source country good pairs, and again, I think this speaks to kind of directly to what you're saying. Most of them seem to be, very kind of evenly, policy changes seem to be pretty evenly dispersed. They're not concentrated at all. You see many small changes rather than, one-off really big changes, right? So that tells you that I guess, most goods out there do seem to be pretty easy for the US to increase and decrease tariffs on, is I guess another way to say that. You don't see very many source country good relationships with big one-off, permanent policy changes. Mostly you see a bunch of small transitory changes. And similarly, when you look at these things by half-life, most policy changes have very small half-lives. They wash out very quickly in the data. You see very few policy changes that, remain in the data for, the entire sample, that don't disappear, okay? So this is just another way to say that most policy changes in the US data anyway are pretty transitory. Certainly they're probably pretty uncertain. They look a lot more like IID, a lot closer to like an IID tariff process than something that is very persistent. As I said, to some degree, this measure also is capturing the some phase-in type stuff, some gradualness and some anticipation, kind of conflating both uncertainty and anticipation. Yeah.
It's about that nature, because if there is a gradual change that changes a lot in the beginning and then slow after, or it changes a little in the beginning and a lot after, that those two will give you the same HHI. But then I think it's quite different from the model, because one is more like anticipated, one's more like changes and then doesn't, right? So, but these two seems like it will give you the same HHI.
Yeah, so that's a fair point. We could try to look at that. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Okay, I got like 2 minutes left, so I'm gonna try to go.
You started 5 minutes late, so we.
Okay. All right. Good. Okay.
Team reps, all right.
That's a little bit, yeah. You may need like an objective moderator to make that determination.
We did start late, but.
Okay. Anyway, the point of this slide is simply to say that it looks like in the data, there's a lot of these issues. So now we're going to try to go out and see when we look at these policy changes, these reforms, different groups of them, ones that appear to be more concentrated versus less concentrated, higher half-lives versus lower half-lives. Do we actually see differences in trade dynamics like the ones that we would expect based on the model? And the answer is that we do. Regardless of how we measure trade dynamics, if you look at JG groups, JG pairs that are highly concentrated in red versus less concentrated in black, what we see is larger long-run trade elasticities in the reforms that appear to be less transitory, less anticipated. whether you measure them just kind of simple differences and differences, use local projections or the error correction mechanism, you see the same kind of thing. The error correction mechanism results suggest as well, it's a little bit harder to see from these pictures, that the short run elasticities are also lower in addition to the long run elasticities being higher in the reforms that appear to be less transitory and less anticipated, which makes sense. Similarly for the half-life groups, and this one we can't do the error correction mechanism because the classification is at the JGT level. So it's kind of hard to, we can't use the same kind of approach, but we can do both of these. And we see the same kind of thing. Reforms that are more transitory, that have lower half-lives, have much lower long-run trade elasticities. When you do it using local projections, in fact, we see, it looks like the long-run trade elasticities are lower than the short run, which is, potentially something that could happen in the model depending on how you're measuring things. But part of this is just coming from the fact that, projecting H period ahead tariff changes on one period tariff changes is kind of meaningless when you're looking at tariff changes that wash out very quickly. What is that? That instrument doesn't really do anything. So maybe this method isn't all that useful in this case. But anyway, what you see in the data is something that looks pretty similar to what we see in the model. Finally, we'll do, what China and Vietnam, two cases that we think of as being pretty darn close to the Platonic quantitative exercise, with one caveat for China that I'll mention in just a moment. But if you look at this relative tariff measure that we've defined for both of these, you can see that both countries experienced more or less immediate permanent policy changes. China in 1980 when it was granted NTR access, and Vietnam, same thing in 2001. After that, the US tariffs on goods from these countries pretty much didn't change. So big one-off policy changes. When you compare these reforms to the rest of the ones that we see in the data, you see much larger long-run trade elasticities for China and Vietnam than kind of the typical reform in the US data. And Vietnam actually also has a pretty high short-run trade elasticity, and when you compare China and Vietnam, we think that kind of makes sense because there was in fact a lot more uncertainty in the China case, at least early on. That uncertainty was ultimately resolved, or mostly resolved, by the 2000s, reflecting kind of a similar long-run response. But the transition took quite a bit longer for China, in part because, as we found in our other work, there was a lot of uncertainty early on. But nevertheless, leaving that aside, the China case is still a hell of a lot closer to kind of the Platonic trade reform than what you see is the case for just kind of the average reform in the US data, which again, we know is pretty transitory, probably features a great deal of anticipation as well. Okay. That's pretty much it. I will, I take my one more minute and just say, coming back to something that I think kind of Sam was talking about a little bit, is that, if you have some information on the extensive margin, could you use that to try to identify the short run trade elasticity? And the answer to that is, at least in a model, yes. So in a model, we can directly observe the number of exporters, and we can just control for how that changes over time. And when we do that in the model, what we see is that in all of the cases where there's a lot of anticipation, we can get pretty darn close to identifying the correct short run elasticity of 4, even in the anticipated and phased in cases, which feature observed very high short run trade elasticities. Because those very high trade elasticities are kind of featuring both extensive margin reaction as well as the intensive margin response that Sam science we want to try to pick up. So that's one way that you can do that. Does a pretty good job when we run the error correction mechanism with this extensive margin control.
Aren't these numbers all about twice as big as the ones you're showing us?
Yeah, well, so that's true. And this is just partly how we've calibrated this model. So the short run elasticity is 4. But the long run elasticities are pretty big. That's certainly true.
But here you seem to have kind of a consistent, like these tables at the bottom, and then
no, that's 100% true. And this is not something that I have time to talk about today. But in our other work, we found we calibrated our models to deliver this long run elasticity of China But our model tells us that there still is a fair amount of uncertainty. Even in the modern times about US trade policy towards China. And if you got rid of that, the long run elasticity would be even higher. So in some sense, the model that we're showing you today is actually, depending on how much uncertainty you think is still present in kind of even these relatively big policy changes, actually consistent with these numbers, right? Even these big numbers could reflect some degree of uncertainty today. I mean, that's one potential interpretation. So that does kind of work. We tried to do that in the data using some proxies for the extensive margin, the number of HS10 products traded at the bilateral level within an SITC category, the number of shipments. It does, we do see to some degree it kind of works. The short run trade elasticity falls. Long run doesn't really change. But we do seem to see some kind of similar changes across these different buckets of reforms. So we kind of like to see if this is working really well. Less of a change over here than over here. But so this is still some work in progress, obviously. But this is kind of, I think, the approach that you could take to this. And moving forward, I think we're just going to we're going to try to look for some direct data on firm level data that will help us on this. Okay, I'm out of time. Let me wrap up. Estimates of trade dynamics depend a lot on the nature of the reform. Most of the reforms that we see in the US data are gradual and transitory and probably subject to both anticipation and uncertainty. So estimating, conventional specifications on these data are probably not generating the trade elasticities that we think of when we think of these kind of canonical true trade elasticities that we use for quantitative work. In particular, the true short run and long run are probably both, on the one hand lower and on the second hand higher than we really think. And, moving forward, trying to sort these things out requires thinking more seriously in the data about how firms are reacting to, forward-looking firms are reacting to information about policy. Okay, out of time, so that's it. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks a lot for your comments.
Someone started someone flipped the.
You have to clean that. That's
Well, but I'm saying in a short window, that doesn't change very much.
Do I have to?
Isn't it all you could kind of say?
I can see that it works, but I don't see the.